Welcome back. Today, we're tackling a deeply human and honestly deeply misunderstood behavior. We are going to unpack the architecture of emotional withdrawal, discovering the true anatomy of silent suffering based on some incredible insights from our source material. Okay, let's dive right into this. I want you to take a moment and really think back to a specific memory. Maybe it started as a silly, mundane argument over something completely trivial, like, I don't know, who was supposed to load the dishwasher or pick up the dry cleaning. But suddenly, it spiraled. You felt so profoundly, entirely misunderstood that you just stopped talking. The words just dried up. Or perhaps you've been on the other side of this dynamic. You're trying to communicate, and suddenly the person you care about goes completely, unnervingly quiet. It feels like they've hit a master mute button on the relationship, right? It's a really jarring experience, that sudden, impenetrable wall of silence. Well, when that wall of silence hits, we tend to make a lot of immediate assumptions. And in today's explainer, we're going to completely reframe what going quiet actually means. It turns out, we've kind of been reading the signals all wrong. The research suggests we actually need to tear down our traditional interpretations of silence during a conflict and look at what the psychological framing tells us is actually happening right beneath the surface. And this brilliantly illustrates the core disconnect. The prevailing myth in our culture is that silence just equals apathy. We see someone stop talking, and we immediately assume they simply don't care anymore. We view it as a rejection, an act of cold punishment, or a cold shoulder designed specifically to push us away. But the reality we found in the source material, vastly different. It's not a lack of care at all. It is instead a collapse inward. Think about that imagery for a second. A collapse. It's structural. It's an internal folding under immense emotional weight, rather than some casual dismissal of the relationship. When you look closely at this definition, it's absolutely fascinating. Emotional withdrawal is an act of self-preservation when hurt, rather than an act of punishment. This is a critical distinction that completely changes how we interact with the people we love. So, the crucial point is this. The silence is a defensive reflex. It is a shield, not a sword. When emotional pain becomes too acute, the psychological system literally shuts down external communication to protect the core. It's a fundamental survival mechanism. The person isn't trying to punish you. They're desperately trying to preserve themselves in a moment where they feel profoundly exposed and wounded. Let's see how this builds, because this heavy silence doesn't just happen out of nowhere. There's actually a sequential timeline to it. Step 1 is the initial hurt. Maybe a sarcastic comment acts as the emotional injury, creating a feeling of invalidation. But the hurt alone doesn't cause the silence. It's step 2 that changes the entire trajectory, the assessment of safety. The mind rapidly calculates the environment. Is it safe to express this hurt? If the answer is no, we hit step 3, the withdrawal, the actual physical and emotional collapse inward, which inevitably leads us to step 4, leaving behind an unspoken need trapped firmly behind that wall of silence. That second step, the assessment of safety, is the absolute pivot point of this entire process. Why do some arguments result in yelling and crying, while others result in this freezing silence? What's really fascinating in the research is that there are 2 very specific conditions that act as triggers for this sudden quiet. It's a rapid-fire internal calculation, and it boils down to 2 distinct realizations that force the human psychological system into full lockdown mode. Now, what's really interesting here is how absolute these 2 triggers are. A person goes quiet because expressing their pain feels unsafe. This usually means emotionally unsafe, a deep fear of being mocked, having their feelings minimized, or having their raw vulnerability weaponized against them. Or, we see the second trigger, expressing pain feels entirely pointless. They've calculated that no matter how loudly they speak or how clearly they try to explain their hurt, it will just fall on deaf ears. If speaking up invites danger, or if it will inevitably change absolutely nothing, the brain simply cuts the microphone. Why expend the agonizing energy to explain your soul if the environment is hostile or the receiver is turned completely off? So, now that we've moved past the myth of apathy and understand the mechanical triggers, let's peel back the final layer to the very core of this silent suffering. Because even though the person has stopped physically speaking out loud, that silence is actually screaming a profound question. It is an incredibly vulnerable plea disguised as an empty room. At the center of that collapse inward is a quiet question. If I stop explaining, will you still try to understand me? That is the ultimate test of emotional connection and empathy. The hurt person is essentially saying to you, look, I have exhausted my capacity to translate my pain into words for you. I no longer feel safe or I no longer feel effective doing so. So if I drop my end of the communication rope, will you come looking for me? Will you care enough to bridge this gap without me having to painstakingly map it out for you? So I leave you with this challenge. The next time the silence falls, whether it's you retreating inward or someone you deeply love going suddenly jarringly quiet, I want you to try and see past the myth. Do not just react to the surface level silence. Don't assume it's a lack of care or a petty punishment. Recognize the collapse. Acknowledge that the environment has either become unsafe or felt entirely pointless to them in that moment. And ask yourself, how will you answer the quiet question? Will you recognize that unspoken need, step forward and try to understand them even when the explaining has stopped?